Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Fest Forward Advisor Talks, brought to you by the Ottawa Festival Network, a not-for-profit service organization that works cooperatively with members and partners towards a vibrant, inspired, and prosperous festival capital. In this podcast series, industry experts break down hot topics in these operational and strategic areas of focus that are essential for any festival and event organization. You will hear best practices and expert advice complemented by real-world examples and lessons learned from fellow festival producers that will help you solve problems, make decisions, and realize your creative visions. This episode breaks down all the tips and tricks to master your grant writing process. We are happy to be joined by grant writing expert Kyra Cole. Kyra is an economic development and tourism leader based in Ontario Southwest. She is the CEO of KLB Consulting and co-owner and CEO of THREESEVEN, an Indigenous consulting firm dedicated to Indigenous economic development. You can find out more information on Kyra and what she is up to in the episode show notes. And I'll remind our listeners that the advice given in this podcast is for general educational purposes only. We recommend seeking out specific advice that can take into account your own circumstances. A big thank you to the Canada Council for the Arts for their support in the making of this podcast, and enjoy the episode.
Ani Bonjour, everybody. My name is Kyra Cole. My pronouns are she and her. And I wanted to start off today by acknowledging that I am coming to you from Leamington, Ontario, which is traditional territory of Caldwell First Nation, who are members of the Three Fires Confederacy. And it's very important to acknowledge that we are all treaty people, that we are on treaty lands, and that we all have a responsibility to reconciliation. So, miigwech to everybody for showing up and listening to this presentation. We are discussing the thrilling, very necessary topic of grant writing and funding. And as I mentioned, my name is Kyra Cole. My background is in economic development, but I also have experience in academia as a museum curator and in Indigenous community development. So that has informed for a long time the work that I've been doing in grant writing and strategic planning. So I'm going to walk us through sort of what does a grant process look like? What are some tips and tricks? What are some things that organizations, events, festivals should be cognizant of as they are applying for funding? First things first, where would you start off looking for new grant opportunities? This might seem sort of intuitive, but it really isn't. The landscape of funding is really wide. Outside of government websites, so the province of Ontario, the federal government, there are a number of different organizations that have funds to give. So this might be for-profit organizations such as Visa, MasterCard, BMO, Desjardins, insurance companies. Often these corporate organizations have a philanthropic arm to them or a charitable arm to them, and they put money back into community organizations. This is separate and apart from what you might see, let's say, in terms of fundraising or sponsorship. So these are grants that you have to apply for. You don't have to put together a sponsorship package, but they are released sort of periodically throughout the year. There's also a number of different services that you can access if you're looking for some support finding funding opportunities. There are companies called Pocketed, MentorWorks, Hockey Stick, Grant Find, and they'll allow you to go on and put in your organizational details and find some funds that might fit. Now, just a bit of a piece of advice is that sometimes they're not super up to date, so you still do need to do some work and go through and make sure that your organization is a fit, but it does kind of narrow it down, and these folks have done the work to review the grant funding landscape. Signing up for newsletters for funders, so Ontario Trillium Foundation, even the various government websites will allow you to sign up for a newsletter so when new funding is released. A really great place to find funding also is Twitter. Twitter and LinkedIn. I find a lot of funding opportunities on LinkedIn. Follow another grant writer who posts about grants often, and I find that that's a really, even for myself as a grant writer, I follow other grant writers, so if they post something that I'm not aware of, it's really super helpful and up to date. uh, carefully read the application guidelines. That's the thing that I can probably stress the most. Attend the information sessions that you are seeing for the grants. If you don't think that it's a fit for your organization, there's a really strong likelihood that the funders are probably unlikely to think it's a fit as well. So if you're unable to craft an argument that fits within the terms, then maybe that's not the fund that you should be applying for. And really, that helps avoid grant fatigue. There's nothing worse than writing an application that you don't really feel is going to be successful. It isn't successful, and then you've spent 30 hours or so writing an application. Also, be really aware of what type of fund you're applying to. So there's a bunch of different types of funds and grants or loans. So even within the loan landscape, what's the interest repayable percentage if you're looking at a loan as opposed to a grant? Is there some loans that have been released recently, particularly in this post-COVID landscape, are 0% interest? So that might be a good option for you, where you're given the money and then you have, let's say, 4 years to pay it back before interest is charged. That might be a good fit. There's a loan grant contribution arrangement where some of it might be a loan, some of it might be a grant. You can choose to spend the grant portion and not the loan. And then there's reimbursement-based funds. This one I find is where nonprofit organizations tend to, it tends to be sort of a stress point because you're required to spend the money up front. So organizationally, if you are sort of facing a cash flow deficit and you don't have the ability to spend that money up front, that can create a real stress in the organization in terms of paying your staff or paying your bills. So be aware if they are a reimbursement-based fund, and don't be afraid to ask the funders if you can get an advance, because sometimes for for-profits, they'll allow advances to come through. And then my favorite of the funds is sort of a milestone-based approach where you'll get a portion of the funds right away. You can start to spend them. Once you've expended the funds, you get another portion, and then there's a holdback upon the final release of the fund. So that's kind of a technical overview of how do you find grants and what are you looking for. But what I think is really important as you look at funding and look at the funding landscape and look at what you're applying for is writing a grant is telling a story. You're telling a story of your organization, you're telling a story of your project, and you're telling a story to a very specific audience who has a very specific need. That's where I find the fun in grant writing, is really you're giving the story to a funder that would make them think that they'd be silly to not fund you. And I think that's probably, it's like a competition. You are crafting a narrative that fits all of their needs. So let's say you are, to put it as an analogy, you're going on a date. You're going on a date with an animal rights activist, and that animal rights activist brings you to a vegan restaurant. If you are a person that's wanting this date to go successfully, probably wouldn't open with your voracious carnivore who has never owned an animal because you don't like animals. So you're really trying to build this relationship with the funders to show them that your organization, your vision, what you're trying to do, and the project that you're doing fits with what their needs are. Often, these are also based on federal guidelines, not only because they're important, but because often they're the right things to do as well. So what's your plan for diversity, equity, inclusion? Are you an accessible organization that is open and welcoming to visitors or attendees? And do people feel like they're being represented and that your event is a safe space? Not only is that an important milestone for almost every fund that I've seen, but it's also an important milestone as an organization if you want to really A, stay relevant, B, do the right thing. And if your organization really isn't, if you're having to ask yourself, how am I responding to a diverse crowd? How am I making this this space feel safe, then perhaps that's something that the organization needs to reflect on a little bit more. Is there an opportunity for us to broaden our audience and be a better organization by inviting and including more people in that? And there's lots of people out there that can support you in giving some guidance on how to be inclusive. The Gay and Lesbian Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Black in Hospitality is another great example. Festival and Events Ontario has some great resources on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm bringing that up early on because I think that that's where I'm seeing a lot of challenges with a lot of organizations. They're struggling with attendance or membership or volunteers. And when you look at the structure and framework of how events are being run, it's because they're not doing the work necessary to be inclusive and be representative of the visitation and traveler needs. A lot of visitor motivation is values-based. That's really prominent coming out of the COVID pandemic. And I think that that's also really important to reflect in your grants. I've heard some feedback from grant adjudicators that there's really a lack of understanding and questions about inclusivity and diversity, that organizations not only are not really meeting those milestones, but they're not understanding what it means to meet those milestones. So that's just a piece of advice that I think is really, really important and really relevant, not only from a funding writing perspective, but from an organizational perspective. And if you have a fund writer that you work with, or if you have somebody that's a consultant that's helping you with your strategic priorities, those are questions that they should be asking as well, because it's important and it's very relevant. And you'll see that a lot of organizations that have that social purpose or that are inclusive and equitable are the ones that are the most successful in funding applications. So now I will get off of my little bit of a soapbox here and talk a little bit more sort of when you should be looking for grants. There is absolutely a particular time of year when you should be looking for grants. Though there are going to be funding applications that go out pretty consistently throughout the year, from a government funding perspective, there is a grant season. That's usually from September to December, and there's a reason for that. It is that the government fiscal year is from April 1st until March 31st. So if you think about what it's like as a government employee, April and May are kind of planning how you're going to spend your money. June to August is vacation season for everybody. I think we're all at our cottages or visiting friends and family. September through to December is when those funds are getting released. And that's also because January to March is when organizations have to spend that money. So I've definitely received successful funding application notifications on Christmas Eve, which is wonderful. It's a great Christmas present. But that means that when you're planning what your fiscal year is going to look like, or what your operational year is going to look like, be cognizant that if you're reliant on government funding, that January through March is going to be a pretty heavy time for you to spend, hire, do some of that organizational and operational planning. If you're looking at your budget as well, ensuring that you have a budget ready and complete before September so that you know what you're going to be applying for, it's also really helpful. And you're then just sort of like fitting a square peg into a square hole instead of trying to make everything work. For-profit organizations have different fiscal years. Funders have different fiscal years. So there are other organizations that might have a monthly release. But in general, some of those larger government funds really are going to be in that September to December deadline. Also, if there's what's called slippage, sometimes you'll hear the government call that extra money that they've come into. And that's if maybe there wasn't as high of an uptake on funding earlier in the year. Then that January, February, you might see another release of funds, or you might have been denied a fund and then kind of get communicated back to that you are successful now because perhaps somebody who had gotten it earlier wasn't able to expend the money that they'd been given. So just be cognizant of that as well. Reaching out to funding advisors is paramount. So they're there to help you. They've been hired by the funders to help you. Um, Attending the information sessions that are available online, um, then connect with the funding advisors. So attend, see if any of the information sessions are giving you the information that you need. Connect with your funding advisor, and I'd approach that conversation really with, this is our project idea. So come already prepared with, okay, this, we've read the application, we've listened to the recommendations. We think that this would be a great project, and they'll walk you through if that project is a fit. They also are often able to review a copy of your grant in advance of you submitting it. So helpful. They know exactly what you're looking for. They can be that second set of eyes to see if you're missing something. Also, we're often so entrenched in our own organizations, our own festivals, our own events, that we forget to include small details that are quite significant, which is another great point. Make no assumptions. Often the funding review panel may come from various different backgrounds, various different organizations or sectors. They likely have no idea who your organization is. Don't make any assumptions, regardless of how prominent your festival or event is or how prominent your organization is. The funders may not know who you are because they're not even in the same sector. And also making sure that you're not using acronyms unless you've spelled out what those mean. So again, sort of sector specific acronyms. Always make sure that you're sort of spelling those out, what the purpose is of those, and then if you want to use acronyms afterwards, just put that in brackets. That'll help people understand what your application is a little bit better. As I mentioned, really the storytelling element of grants is what makes it so spectacular. You can really weave an emotive. Everybody gets into the festivals and events, organizations, because they care. You care about the mission, you care about the goals and objectives. You think that it's purposeful what you're doing, and that's really important to communicate. Don't be afraid to share some success stories, share some impacts, not only on sort of quality or quantitative. So, what's the economic impact of your event? But what are some of the qualitative factors? So, we raised X number of dollars for hospice in our area through this festival. It had an economic impact of X million dollars. But on top of that, we ensured that people were given access to meaningful, supportive, empathetic, compassionate care in the last stages of their life. So really sharing the reasoning, the emotion, and the story behind why your organization does what it does. And weave the story together in a way that makes sense. It really is a story. This is my organization. This is how the project that we're looking to do aligns with the organizational missions. And this is how those missions and this project align with the funders' goals and guidelines. Don't be afraid to pull directly from the wording of the application guidelines. This project will create new jobs and new cultural opportunities in our community by. So really being very explicit with what they're looking for and how you are exactly fitting into the requirements and needs of that fund. So after going through what the funding objectives are, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. So these are the activities. In December, we're going to create a strategic plan that will help us plan for next year. And in January, we're going to hire 2 people to do X, Y, and Z. And we're going to order our equipment. And then this is how much it's going to cost for us to do that. So really, that's how all grants are kind of laid out, is what are we doing, or who are we? What are we doing? When are we doing it? And how much is it going to cost? Then will come the questions like, okay, so what are you doing if anything comes up that is unexpected? So what are the risks? What's the mitigation? more often than not, to go back to the government's inclusivity guidelines, they'll also say, and what are you doing to be cognizant of either sustainable practices, regenerative practices, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those usually come sort of in and around or after the budget section of a grant. Although all grants are different and they all have different objectives, the layout is pretty similar. And it's really helpful then to create sort of a template answer for those typical questions. I use Smartsheets, which is like a project management software. You can use Excel. You can use Asana. You can use really any sort of project management software to track grants, depending on how important or how many grants you're managing. I do a grant spreadsheet where I look at all the projects, what are my costs for the year, so that I'm not overlapping and double dipping. And what double dipping is, if you're not familiar with that, is you can't have two grants funding the same thing. So if I had a grant funding my salary, I can't get another grant to fund that same portion of my salary. And that's a big no-no, and that would is something to be really cognizant of. But yes, so I track my funding opportunities, what stage of application I'm at, when our reports due, how much did we ask for, how much were we successful for, and then a spreadsheet of all of our costs. And those costs, when we've spent the money, when we can report on them, it really takes a lot of upfront work, but takes so much pressure off at the end because you know exactly what you're doing. The one thing I love about Smartsheets is that I can actually attach my final funding application and my contribution agreement as an attachment in that. So I'm not looking through files and trying to figure out like what was the one that I submitted, what was the budget that we ended up going with, what did they approve. So that really helps me keep track of things. Again, you can do a lot of it in Excel and sort of hyperlink it to a Google Drive or something, but keeping everything in one place is super relevant and super important. As I mentioned, sort of preparing a template of the typical questions. So 150 to 250 words of your organization. Who are you? What is your mission? When were you founded? Are you a for-profit or a nonprofit? How many staff do you have? Who is your decision maker? So you have a board of directors. Are they a governance board of directors? Or are they a strategic board of directors? Who makes the decisions in the organization? And again, these are just like one or two lines for each of these things. But if you have a template, it's so easy to adjust when you have a million. Nobody's writing a million grants, maybe me, but but when you have a number of grants that are due, having something to pull from is really, really important and saves you a ton of time and energy. And then if you have somebody else in your organization that you want to sort of take over writing grants, then they've got all the information that they need to be successful right at their fingertips. And that being said, keeping those financial documents that you normally need to attach to every grant somewhere accessible. So your financial statements, your articles of incorporation, normally a list of board of directors or key staff. Those are all really helpful to keep as an attachment. Also make sure when you're looking at the requirements for financials that the level of financials that you have, it are meeting the deadline. Trillium is a great example. They require a certain level of financial statements if you are an organization that pulls in X number of dollars a year. So be really cognizant of that because they don't always give you the opportunity to revise anything once it's submitted. They'll just say your financials weren't up to par. Sorry. That being said, you can also build those fees into grant applications. If you know it's going to cost you $5,000 to get your financials audited every year, put that in. Also, put in your admin line items. Usually grants allow you to put between 10 and 15% of your organizational costs into the application. And that's not always clear what that means. that means if you are renting a building, your heat, your hydro, your internet, cell phones, the wages for the executive director or for the project coordinator, incremental fees. Like if you know that it's going to take your finance team 20 hours, you can put 20 hours worth of work into your admin fees. The biggest pitfall I see with organizations is that they don't think about the time that it takes to either execute a project or the capacity that they need in order to manage funding requirements and reporting requirements. Don't be afraid to write a project manager into your funding application. Somebody who can coordinate the reporting, somebody who can coordinate the project as a whole. If you were an executive director and you were wearing 17 different hats, you may not have the capacity to run an entirely new program line item that you funded. So don't be afraid to write project management into your fund either, and really keep yourself from burning out. Like it's a tough industry, particularly festivals and events. It's longevity of the organization is important, and I think ensuring that you have proper capacity to do that is really, really critical. And I think it's also prohibitive for a lot of organizations why they don't apply for grants is because they think they're going to have to take everything on with the existing staff that they have and not realize that they can bring people in funded through these projects to help support them. There's only a couple of other key questions that you'll want to have a boilerplate response for. Your staff and their experience, your board, and again, what type of board it is. And then also, I like to have a boilerplate for risk and mitigation. So this is the risk, or this is the assumption that we're making. We're assuming that we're going to have 15 new acts on stage at our event. The risk is that we can't secure people in the timeline that's allotted for this fund. How are we going to mitigate that? We're going to leverage our relationship with arts organizations or music organizations. We are going to put a call out for folks before we've heard if we're successful in the funding or not, to sort of start a roster so that we can hit go as soon as we've got notification of funding. Another risk that's very common is pandemics, health-related risks. So knowing always what are you going to do if the world gets shut down again, or the ability to gather in person. That's really, really relevant, I think, nowadays. People are, especially funders, have all been in the landscape of approving projects and then those projects having to be delayed with risks that could have been mitigated. Or not. Sometimes there's a little bit more flexibility, but sometimes it's very easily mitigatable risks. So, okay, well, let's say before COVID, our event couldn't happen because it rained. It's like, okay, well, we had an outdoor event. There's weather is unpredictable. The organization really should, unless it's torrential downpours or a massive thunderstorm, like there should have been a plan in place. And the funders want to see that because they want to know that they're going to be able to be successful and be able to showcase that they're achieving their goals. Because at the end of the day, they've got goals that they need to report on as well. My last piece of advice is to keep Word documents for everything. I can't begin to tell you how many folks I know, myself included, that have gotten all the way through an application and then the PDF crashed and you lost all of your writing. Put it in a Word document and copy and paste it into the PDF when you're finished. It will save you so much time, so many tears, so many tears. I say this at the beginning. Inevitably, when I have new grant writers on staff, I get a call probably within the first couple of months, like, I didn't do what you said, and I didn't put it in a Word document, and I lost it. And it only takes one time, but it could be a 37-page grant application. So it also helps you not having to copy and paste from a PDF when you want to use similar Word responses. So I think those are sort of my top tips for funding applications. It's a fun world, and there's so much more money out there than I think people realize. Um, be smart about the applications that you're putting forward. Be critically examine what goals you want as an organization, and then find funds that fit with that. Um, that will help you be successful. It'll help you avoid grant burnout, which is a real thing. Um, and it'll help you be the most successful that you can, because you're going into these applications with um, an immense amount of confidence that you have a project that fits. So that's grant writing in a nutshell. Now go out and get millions of dollars.
And that wraps up this episode of Fest Forward Advisor Talks, presented by the Ottawa Festival Network. All of the resources and links mentioned throughout this episode will be available in the episode show notes, as well as transcriptions in both French and English. For information on OFN and our members, please visit us online at ottawafestivals.ca. And if you have any questions or feedback related to this podcast, please send us an email at festforward@ottawafestivals.ca. Thank you so much for listening, and please remember to subscribe to this podcast to catch future episodes, where we will dive into even more hot topics festival and event organizations need to know to grow and support their organizations. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues and leave us a review. That's all for now. Stay tuned and stay festive.